Katie. We have the Whispering Statue. We are on Chapter 12, Unexpected Clue. Bess and George also stare at the initials on the base of the statue. MDK! They exclaimed, recalling what Nancy had told them about the notation in Mr. Basswood's office. Turning to Mr. Holden, Nancy asked, "Do you know a sculptor with the initials MDK?"
"No, but I can look up this person in my directory of painters and sculptors. I'll do it as soon as I get back to New York and let you know."
The statue was set in place again. As Mr. Holden walked back to the clubhouse with the girls and Mr. Ayer, he offered to consult various trade journals to find out who had sold the original Whispering Statue.
"Also, who purchased it, and what the price was. But don't get your hopes up too high," he warned. "I'm inclined to think it was a secret deal and not reported because the Whispering Statue was stolen. Later I'll take some measurements of this reproduction. These will be the same size as the original."
"How can that be?" Bess spoke up. Mr. Holden explained that the rubbery material a sculptor brushes over the original work produces a skin-tight mold.
"The cast, which is made from the mold, is therefore the same size as the original."
So the mold, what comes out of the mold is called a cast.
"And I would say that the patina of the stolen statue, meaning its surface color, would be somewhat different from that of the lady out on the lawn, even though the reproduction is an excellent one."
George asked, "Mr. Holden, could the thief have sold the original statue at such a high price he became worried and tried to ward off suspicion by having a reproduction made to try and fool people?"
"Oh, yes," the sculptor replied. "I would say that the original was worth many thousands of dollars."
"Hypers!" George burst out. Then she said, "I wonder if this MDK is in league with the thief, or if he was just paid to do a job without knowing the reason." Mr. Ayer looked at the girls and smiled.
"I expect Debbie Lynbrook and her friends to find that out."
Mr. Holden proved to be a fascinating companion and related many interesting and amusing stories about his work.
"I think my worst subject was a small boy whose mother wanted a statue of her little darling. But the boy couldn't sit still for more than 15 seconds at a time. He seemed scared to death of me every time I came near him with a tape measure. Finally, I just gave up and took a lot of pictures of him."
The girls laughed, and George asked, "How did it all work out? Did you make the statue?"
"Oh, yes," Mr. Holden answered, "but I had to charge the mother a rather high price for all the extra time it took."
During a slight lull in the conversation, Nancy asked the sculptor if he would stop at Basswood's art and bookshop the following morning. "I'd like you to look over the statues and statuettes and see if they're fairly priced."
"I'd be glad to," Mr. Holden promised. "Since I'll be going through the town on my way home, I'll drive you there."
Suddenly he began to chuckle.
"It's possible Mr. Basswood may think he recognizes me from photographs he might have seen in magazines or newspapers, so I believe I'll change my name too. How about Harry Silver?"
"I'll remember," Nancy answered. "I think it's a good idea." The next morning, when they arrived at the shop, Nancy had a hard time keeping a straight face as she said to Mr. Basswood, "I'd like you to meet Mr. Harry Silver. He was staying at the yacht club and offered to drive me over. Mr. Silver, this is Mr. Basswood." The two men shook hands. Then the visitor was invited to sign the register. Nancy was confident Harry Silver, New York City, was a good disguise. She went on, "May I show Mr. Silver some of our fine pieces?"
"Go ahead. I'll be in my office any time you need me."
Whenever the shop owner disappeared, Nancy wondered if he had some secret means of spying on her. She showed Mr. Silver some of the fine paintings, but he shook his head and said,
"How about some of the statuettes? This is an attractive one."
He pointed toward a boy, wearing ragged knee trousers and a loose-sleeved, low-necked shirt. He was barefoot and carried a fishing pole over one shoulder. As Mr. Holden picked up the statuette, Mr. Basswood suddenly reappeared and watched him sharply. The sculptor turned the piece over and looked at the base. He whistled.
"This is highly priced." he remarked, and set the statuette down. "Too much money for me."
Some of Nancy's suspicions had been confirmed. She gave no sign of her elation. "Mr. Silver," she said, "perhaps you'd be interested in a smaller piece." She led him to the statuette of a man seated cross-legged and whittling a piece of wood, so he's carving it into a shape.
"That is interesting,"
he commented. Once more he turned the statuette over and looked at the sales sticker. Then he sighed.
"I'm afraid there isn't anything here within my price range."
Mr. Basswood's eyes flashed.
"Sculptors don't give away their work,"
he snapped.
"And these are originals?"
Mr. Silver asked.
"Of course."
The caller said he guessed he would have to go somewhere else and buy a copy. Nancy noted that the sculptor avoided the word reproduction. She also wondered if the pieces were not originals. She hoped for an opportunity to ask Mr. Silver. When the sculptor said he must leave because he had a long drive back to New York City, she followed him to the door. Mr. Basswood went along, so there was no chance for her to speak privately to Mr. Holden. Disappointed, she said goodbye and closed the door. Turning to Mr. Basswood, she asked, "How is Mr. Atkin?"
"Coming along. It was certainly mighty inconsiderate of him to pick a time like this to get sick. You know yourself how rushed we've been here."
Nancy pretended to look hurt. "I'm doing the best I can, Mr. Basswood."
Yes, I know," he said, "but we've got to keep this place cleaner. Go get a dust cloth and wipe off the books."
Before Nancy went for it, she remarked, "When Mr. Silver turned over the statuette, I noticed the initials MDK on the base. What do they stand for?" Was it her imagination, or did Mr. Basswood show a sudden bit of alarm? His fright was gone in a moment, and he replied,
"I really don't know. I bought those pieces at an auction and never did inquire who the sculptor was."
He turned toward the rare books section, and Nancy went to the back room for the dust cloth. Unlike other mornings, half an hour went by and not a customer had come in. Nancy said to her employer, "Since I've finished dusting and there isn't any special work to do in the shop, is there anything I can help you with in the office?" Mr. Basswood's face took on a dark look.
"You stay out of my office!" he almost shouted at her. "Get another cloth and dust off the paintings."
She was back in a few seconds, apparently before Mr. Basswood expected her. She had seen him take a book from a shelf, and upon hearing her footsteps had tucked it under his coat. She was puzzled. Why didn't he want her to know he had it? "I wonder what that book is," she thought. As soon as she had dusted the paintings, Nancy went over to the bookshelves. Because of her special interest in the books, she had memorized the titles of all the volumes. In a few moments she realized that Mr. Basswood had taken one of the modern painters and sculptors. Did he think MDK was mentioned in it and did not want her to find out? As she stood in the book section mulling over this, suddenly the whole building began to shake. Statuettes, paintings, and books flew through the air. "It must be an earthquake," Nancy thought, trying to keep her balance. The next instant an enormous book was dislodged from an upper shelf and fell directly toward her head. Uh-oh. Hope she doesn't get bonked.